In March 2026, 3 men were executed in the United States. 2 in Florida. 1 in Texas. 3 death chambers. 3 sets of final words. 3 families of victims who had waited years, in some cases decades, for a morning that never felt like closure when it finally came. One of these executions took 22 minutes to complete. That made it one of the longest lethal injections carried out in the state of Florida in recent memory. The man strapped to the gurney had been on death row for 35 years. He had been 18 years old when he committed the crime. 84 days past his 18th birthday to be exact. That detail would become one of the most contested facts in his case, cited by a retired Florida Supreme Court justice in a public appeal for commutation that the governor ultimately rejected. The second man had stabbed a woman and her 8-year-old son to death. The woman's 12-year-old son survived. He had been stabbed 25 times. He survived, testified at trial, and then, 13 years later, stood at the execution chamber window and watched the man who killed his mother and his little brother receive a lethal injection. A tear rolled down the condemned man's face as he looked at him through the glass and said he was sorry. The third case is the one that changed American law enforcement forever. A young mother was abducted from her home in Northport, Florida while her husband was at work. Her 2 sons, one aged 2 years, the other just 6 months old, were left alone in their cribs. While bound inside her abductor's vehicle, she managed to get hold of his mobile phone. She dialed 911. She told the dispatcher exactly where she was. She begged for her life. The call was received. Units were dispatched. And she still died. What the investigation into that 911 call revealed, and what it forced law enforcement agencies across the entire country to reform, is something most people watching this have never been told. But before we get to that, there is a detail about the first execution, the one that lasted 22 minutes, that still draws scrutiny from legal observers and death penalty researchers. A detail buried in the documented timeline of that evening that raises questions nobody in the state of Florida has fully answered. You will understand why it matters before this documentary is over. 3 men. 3 states. 3 cases that together expose something about the American criminal justice system that no single headline has ever captured in full. This is what the records show.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Billy Leon Kearse was born into a world that had already decided he did not matter. He grew up in poverty, in a home marked by abuse and neglect, in circumstances that courts and advocates would later document in detail during the long years of his appeals. He was not a man who had fallen through the cracks of the system. He was a man the system had never caught in the first place. By the time he was a teenager, the foundations of a stable life, safety, consistency, adult protection, had never been laid. What filled that absence, as it does for so many young men raised in those conditions, was the street. And the street, in the world Billy Kearse grew up in, had its own rules, its own hierarchies, and its own brutal logic. He had a prior criminal history before the night that defined the rest of his life. He was not unknown to law enforcement, but nothing in his record predicted the scale of what was coming. Nothing prepared the city of Fort Pierce, Florida, for what would happen on an otherwise unremarkable evening in 1991. On that night, a traffic stop was initiated. The officer who made that stop was Parrish. He was 29 years old. He was a Fort Pierce Police Department officer who, by every account on record, was doing exactly what he was trained to do. He pulled over a vehicle. He approached it. And what happened next lasted only seconds but echoed for 35 years. Billy Kearse fired 14 times. 9 of those rounds struck Parrish in the body. 4 more rounds hit his body armor. The officer died. He was 29 years old, and he never went home that night, and the city of Fort Pierce lost something it would spend decades trying to name. Kearse was 18 years old when he pulled that trigger. 84 days past his 18th birthday. That number, 84 days, would become one of the most argued figures in the entire legal history of his case. Had he committed the crime 84 days earlier, he would have been a juvenile. The entire trajectory of what followed, the charge, the trial, the sentence, the 3.5 decades on death row, would have been different. Whether that difference would have been just as a question that a retired Florida Supreme Court justice, among others, felt strongly enough about to put their name to a public document demanding the governor reconsider. The governor did not reconsider. The investigation that followed the murder of Officer Parrish was swift. Kearse was identified, located, and arrested. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The number of rounds fired, the trajectory of each shot, the documented condition of the victim, all of it pointed to one man. There was no ambiguity in what the crime scene told investigators. Kearse went to trial and the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence handed down was death. He arrived on Florida's death row a teenager. He would spend the next 35 years there. And in that time, the world outside changed in ways that would eventually circle back to the question of whether what had been done to him, and what he had done, could be understood differently with the passage of time and the accumulation of knowledge about child development, trauma, and the neuroscience of adolescent decision-making. Courts across the country in the years after Kearse's sentencing began to reckon seriously with the question of juvenile culpability. The United States Supreme Court issued landmark rulings restricting the application of the death penalty and mandatory life sentences to juvenile offenders. Those rulings did not save Billy Kearse, because he had been 18 when he committed the crime. 18 is not a juvenile under American law. But 84 days is a very small margin when you are talking about a human life. Inside Florida's death row, Kearse spent his years in the particular suspended existence that death row creates. He was not serving time in the conventional sense. He was waiting. The appeals process in capital cases in the United States is one of the most prolonged and procedurally exhausting legal mechanisms in the world. It is not uncommon for a condemned man to spend 20, 30, even 40 years in that waiting state, moving through courts and motions and stays and denials at a pace that bears no resemblance to any normal experience of time. Kearse moved through all of it. Every avenue was eventually exhausted. Advocates on his behalf did not give up easily. Amnesty International documented his case. A retired Florida Supreme Court justice co-authored a public opinion piece urging Governor Ron DeSantis to commute his sentence to life imprisonment. The argument was not that Kearse was innocent. Nobody argued that. The argument was that a man who committed a crime 84 days past his 18th birthday, who had grown up in documented poverty and abuse, who had spent 35 years on death row, was not the same moral or legal case as a mature adult who commits a premeditated killing with full cognitive development behind them. The governor signed the death warrant. On March 3, 2026, Billy Leon Kearse was taken to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was 53 years old. He declined his last meal. That detail alone, the refusal of a final meal, is documented in cases across death row history as carrying different meanings for different men. For some it is protest. For some it is indifference. For some it is something harder to name, a kind of resignation that has moved past hunger entirely. The execution began. And then it did not end quickly. 22 minutes passed before Billy Kearse was pronounced dead at 6:24 in the evening. 22 minutes is a long time for a lethal injection. It is longer than the documented average. It is long enough that observers in the chamber noticed. It is long enough that the question of what those 22 minutes felt like, whether the process was proceeding as it should, whether the condemned man was experiencing what he should or should not have been experiencing, is a question that has not been answered with any official transparency. Florida has faced legal challenges over its execution protocols before. The 22-minute duration of the Kearse execution added another data point to a record that death penalty opponents and medical experts have cited repeatedly in arguing that lethal injection, presented as a clinical and humane method, is neither as clinical nor as humane as its design suggests. Before he died, Billy Kearse was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He looked out at the people gathered in the observation room. Among them was Mirtha Busbin, the widow of Danny Parrish. The woman who had spent 35 years carrying the weight of a March night in 1991 when her husband drove to work and did not come back. Kearse spoke directly to her family. He said he sincerely apologized for what he had done. He said there was no way he could ever repay what had been taken. He asked for strength to seek forgiveness. He asked for peace. Mirtha Busbin, in the hours after the execution, said something that few people anticipated. She said she could forgive him. She said she could move on. She said the apology had given her something. Whether that something was closure or simply the end of waiting, is not something any document can record. But she said it, and it was heard. Billy Leon Kearse was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. on March 3, 2026. He was the first of 3 men executed in the United States that month. He had been on death row longer than some of the correctional officers who processed his final paperwork had been alive. And in the end, the debate about those 84 days, about the line between juvenile and adult, about what the state owes to a man shaped by poverty and abuse before he was old enough to vote, none of it changed the outcome. The warrant was signed. The chamber was prepared. The clock ran for 22 minutes. And then it stopped. What came next, in a Texas execution chamber 8 days later, was a different kind of case entirely. A different kind of violence. A different kind of survivor. And a moment at an execution chamber window that nobody who witnessed it has been able to forget. Billy Kearse had fired at a stranger in uniform. A split second on a roadside that lasted 35 years in a death row cell. Cedric Allen Ricks knew his victim. That distinction matters. It changes the texture of the violence entirely. It changes what the crime means, what it reveals about the man who committed it, and what it left behind in the people who survived it. Because in the Ricks case, someone did survive. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus Figueroa survived 25 stab wounds and lived long enough to testify against the man who inflicted them. And then, 13 years after that testimony, he stood at an execution chamber window and watched that same man die. That moment, a survivor at the glass, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. Cedric Allen Ricks was 51 years old when the state of Texas executed him on March 11, 2026. He had been on death row since his conviction for a crime committed in May of 2013. The gap between offense and execution, 13 years, is not unusual for Texas death row. The appeals process is long and procedurally grinding regardless of which state a condemned man is held in. But 13 years is long enough for a 12-year-old boy to become a 25-year-old man. Long enough for the shape of grief to change several times over. Long enough for Marcus Figueroa to decide when the time came that he wanted to be in that room. Before any of that, there was the life Cedric Ricks lived before May 2013. The documented record of his early life and background is less extensively detailed in public sources than the crime itself and its aftermath. What is established is that Ricks was in a relationship with Roxann Sanchez, and that relationship had ended. Roxann was 30 years old in May 2013. She had 2 sons. Marcus was 12. Anthony was 8. Whatever the relationship between Ricks and Sanchez had been, it was over by the time of the attack. And the end of that relationship, by every account the investigation and trial produced, had not been accepted by Cedric Ricks. The dynamic of a man refusing to accept the end of a relationship, turning that refusal into violence, is one of the most documented patterns in domestic homicide research. It does not require a complicated psychological profile. It requires a man who has decided that his feelings about a woman outweigh her right to exist without him. That is what the evidence in the Ricks case describes. In May 2013, Cedric Ricks went to Roxann Sanchez's home. What happened inside that home was documented in forensic detail during the investigation and laid out before a jury at trial. Ricks stabbed Roxann Sanchez to death. He stabbed her 8-year-old son Anthony Figueroa to death. Anthony was 8 years old. He had done nothing. He was simply there. And Marcus, 12 years old, was there too. Ricks stabbed him 25 times. 25 times is not a number that requires elaboration. It speaks entirely for itself. What it tells you about the nature of the attack, about the sustained and deliberate nature of the violence, is something no court document needs to underline. Marcus Figueroa survived. The medical response, the treatment he received, the sheer biological fact of his survival after 25 stab wounds, all of it is documented. He lived. And in living, he became the most important witness the prosecution had. Marcus testified at trial. He described what he had seen and what had been done to him. He was a child giving testimony about the murder of his mother and his little brother and the 25 wounds in his own body. The jury convicted Cedric Allen Ricks of capital murder. The sentence was death. Ricks was transferred to Texas death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas. The Polunsky Unit houses Texas death row inmates in single-cell solitary confinement, a policy that has been criticized extensively by mental health researchers, human rights organizations, and death penalty legal advocates over many years. Each condemned man lives in a cell measuring approximately 60 square feet. They are alone for 22 or more hours each day. They eat alone. They exercise alone in a small cage. Human contact is minimal and heavily structured. It is an environment that, over years, does measurable psychological damage to the people held inside it. Cedric Ricks spent approximately 13 years in that environment. During those years, the appeals process ran its course. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed his case and declined to recommend clemency. No stay of execution was granted. The execution date of March 11, 2026 held. What is documented about Ricks's time on death row beyond the legal proceedings is limited in public record. What is documented is the outcome. And part of that outcome is what happened in the hours before the execution itself. Marcus Figueroa, by March 2026, was 25 years old. He had spent more than half his life carrying the specific weight of what had happened in May 2013. He made the decision to attend the execution. He was present in the observation room at the Huntsville unit, at the window closest to the condemned man. That detail, the window closest, is not incidental. It is a choice. It says something about what Marcus Figueroa needed from that moment that no interview or statement fully captures. On March 11, 2026, Cedric Allen Ricks was brought into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 51 years old. The lethal injection used was pentobarbital, the single drug protocol Texas has used in recent executions. He was pronounced dead at 6:55 in the evening. Before he died, he was given the opportunity to make a final statement. What Ricks said in those final minutes is documented in full, and it is worth sitting with. He addressed the family of Roxann Sanchez first. He said he was sorry for taking Roxann and Anthony away from them. He said he could not imagine the pain it had caused. He said he was glad he was able to speak those words to them face to face. Then he turned his attention to Marcus. He said he had always thought about him. He said he was sorry for taking his mother and his brother away. He said he hated that Marcus had to experience what he experienced. He said he could not imagine it. He said he was truly sorry for what he had done. And then, in his closing words, he said something that sits in an uncomfortable space between sincerity and the impossible. He said he hoped to find Roxann and Anthony in heaven so he could tell them he was sorry face to face. He said he did not wish the family any more pain. He said he hoped they would go in peace. As he spoke to Marcus, a tear rolled down Cedric Ricks's face. Marcus Figueroa stood at the window closest to the gurney and watched all of it. What Marcus felt in that moment, what those words did or did not give him, is not something any document records. He was 25 years old. He had been 12 when his mother and his brother were killed and when his own body was stabbed 25 times. He had testified. He had waited. He had shown up. Whatever he took out of that room on the evening of March 11, 2026, he had earned the right to it in a way that very few people ever have to earn anything. Cedric Allen Ricks was pronounced dead at 6:55 p.m. He was the second of 3 men executed in the United States in March 2026. The third case was different from either of the first two in one specific and significant way. The third case did not end with the execution. It ended with a change in the law. Not in one state. Across the entire country. There are cases that change laws. Not because the crime was the worst ever committed. Not because the offender was the most dangerous ever sentenced. But because of what the case exposed about the systems that were supposed to prevent it. About the gaps that opened up at the exact moment they were most needed. About the people who were in position to help and did not, and the institutional failures that made that possible. The case of Michael Lee King is one of those cases. He was 54 years old when the state of Florida executed him on March 17, 2026. He had been on death row since his conviction for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 21-year-old Denise Amber Lee in January 2008. The crime itself is among the most documented and most discussed in Florida's modern criminal history. Not only because of what King did, but because of what happened during the hours he was doing it. Because Denise Lee was alive for part of that time. She was conscious. She had a phone. She called for help. And the help that was supposed to come did not come in time. That is the threat. That is the detail that turned a murder case into a national reform movement. Before January 17, 2008, Michael Lee King was a man living in Northport, Florida. His documented background includes a severe head injury sustained in childhood when a sled collision with a wooden post caused structural damage to his frontal lobe. That injury and the neurological abnormalities it produced would become a central argument in the mitigation phase of his trial and in the years of appeals that followed his conviction. The frontal lobe governs impulse control, judgment, and the regulation of behavior. Documented structural abnormalities in that region are not a defense in law, but they are a context. They are part of the record of who Michael Lee King was before he became what the evidence says he became on a January evening in 2008. What exactly shaped King beyond that injury, what the full architecture of his life looked like before the crime, is less comprehensively documented in public record than the offense itself. What is established is that he was known in his community. He was not a figure who had accumulated a long and violent prior record that should have flagged him to law enforcement as an imminent threat. He was, by external appearances, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a small Florida city. Denise Amber Lee was 21 years old on January 17, 2008. She was married. She had 2 sons. One was 2 years old. The other was 6 months old. Her husband was at work that day. She was home with the children. Michael Lee King abducted her from her home. The 2 infant boys were left alone in their cribs. What followed over the next several hours is documented in court records, forensic evidence, witness testimony, and most significantly, in a 911 call that Denise Lee made herself while she was bound inside King's vehicle. She had managed to get hold of his mobile phone. She dialed 911. She told the dispatcher she had been kidnapped. She described the vehicle. She gave her location. She begged for her life with the clarity and composure of someone who understood exactly what was happening to her and was fighting with everything she had to survive it. The call was received by the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office Communications Center. What happened on that call, and in the calls that followed as other witnesses also dialed 911 to report a disturbance or a suspicious vehicle, is what turned this case into something beyond a murder trial. Multiple 911 calls were made that day by multiple callers who had seen King's vehicle, who had witnessed Denise Lee in distress, who had provided information that, had it been acted upon with appropriate urgency and coordination, might have intercepted King before the outcome became irreversible. It was not acted upon in that way. The dispatchers who received those calls made errors. Some calls were mishandled. Information was not relayed with the speed or accuracy the situation demanded. The precise nature of each failure is documented in the investigation that followed and in the legal proceedings and policy reviews that came after. The details are not ambiguous. Multiple people called. Multiple people described what they saw. Denise Lee called herself and told them directly. And Michael Lee King shot her in the face and buried her body in a remote area of Charlotte County before law enforcement located her. She was found. But she was not found in time. The aftermath of her death did not end with King's arrest and trial. It continued in legislative chambers and emergency services training rooms and 911 dispatch centers across the United States. Her father, her husband Nathan Lee, and her family became advocates for 911 reform with a focus and a determination that is itself documented across years of public record. The law that emerged from their advocacy, in Florida first and then influencing national standards, is known informally as Denise's Law. It mandated reforms to 911 dispatch training, call handling protocols, and interagency communication requirements. It changed how dispatchers are trained to handle calls involving abductions and active violence situations. It changed what information must be relayed and how fast it must move between agencies. Denise Lee never came home. But what she set in motion, in the hours she spent fighting to survive, changed the infrastructure of emergency response across an entire country. Michael Lee King was arrested, charged, tried, and convicted of kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. The trial produced overwhelming evidence. The 911 recordings alone documented the crime in a way that left no question about what had occurred and who had perpetrated it. King was sentenced to death and transferred to Florida's death row. His appeals, as with all capital cases, were extensive and prolonged. The neurological evidence, the documented frontal lobe abnormalities resulting from the childhood head injury, was presented and argued across multiple proceedings. Courts considered it and ultimately did not find it sufficient to overturn the conviction or the sentence. The warrant was signed. In the years King spent on death row, the world that Denise Lee's death had changed continued to change. Dispatch centers trained differently. Protocols were revised. Her name was attached to legislation. Her husband Nathan Lee became a public figure in the reform movement, speaking about what had been lost and what needed to be different. He raised their two sons. The boy who had been 2 years old in January 2008 grew up. The boy who had been 6 months old grew up. They grew up without their mother. On March 17, 2026, Michael Lee King was taken to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was 54 years old. His last meal was pizza, ice cream, soda, and tater tots, a detail that is documented in public record and that sits with a strange mundane weight against everything else in his file. Before he died, King made a final statement. He spoke about having found Jesus in prison. He said that since that time he had tried to live as a disciple, following what he described as the two great commandments, to love God completely, and to love his neighbor, which he said included everyone. He specifically named Denise Lee's family. He closed by citing a Bible verse, Matthew 22 verse 37 through 40, and said that anyone who wanted true peace should ask Jesus into their heart. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. Nathan Lee, Denise's husband, spoke after the execution. He said it was finally over. He said the chapter was closed. But the chapter that Denise Lee opened, the one that runs through every 911 dispatch center that now trains differently, through every protocol that was rewritten because of what happened to her, through every call that is now handled with the urgency hers deserved, that chapter has not closed. It is ongoing. It is, in the most documented and verifiable sense, her legacy. 3 men were executed in the United States in March 2026. 3 different crimes. 3 different states. 3 different sets of circumstances that led to 3 different death chambers. But running through all 3 cases, if you look at the full documented record, is a single thread. It is the thread of what happens when systems fail the people inside them. When a boy grows up without protection and becomes a man who kills. When a woman tries to leave a relationship and is murdered for it along with her child. When a young mother calls for help from inside her abductor's car and the help does not arrive in time. The executions closed 3 legal cases. They did not close the questions those cases raised. Those questions are structural. They live in policy documents and training manuals and legislative records and the memories of survivors. They will outlast every man who was strapped to a gurney in March 2026 by a very long time. 3 men were executed in the United States in March 2026. And in the weeks that followed, the coverage moved on as it always does. The names cycled through news alerts and were replaced by other names. The families of the victims returned to lives they had been living in parallel with these cases for years, now carrying whatever the executions had given them or failed to give them. But there is something the cumulative record of these 3 cases reveals that no single headline captured. In all 3 cases, the condemned men apologized. All 3. Billy Kearse apologized to the widow of the officer he killed, and she said she forgave him. Cedric Ricks wept as he apologized to the surviving son of the woman and child he murdered. Michael Lee King named the family of Denise Lee in his final religious statement. 3 men, 3 death chambers, 3 apologies. What the documented record cannot answer, and what legal scholars, victims' rights advocates, and criminal justice researchers have debated across decades of capital punishment in the United States, is what an apology at the moment of execution is worth. Whether it is the product of genuine transformation, of institutional religious programming, of the psychological pressure of imminent death, or of something else entirely, is not something any court document resolves. What is documented is that all 3 men said the words. And what is documented is that the people who heard those words responded differently. One widow said she found peace. One survivor stood at the window and received the apology directly. One husband said the chapter was closed. 3 different responses to 3 apologies from 3 men who had done irreversible things. The broader truth the March 2026 executions expose is not about the men on the gurneys. It is about the systems that produced them and the systems that failed their victims. A boy raised in documented poverty and abuse who committed a crime 84 days past his 18th birthday and spent 35 years waiting to die. A man whose refusal to accept the end of a relationship ended 3 lives and permanently altered a 4th. A woman who called 911 from inside her abductor's car and died because the call was mishandled. 3 cases. 3 systemic failures. 3 points on a map of everything the American criminal justice and social welfare system still has not fully resolved. Billy Leon Kearse was executed on March 3, 2026, in Florida, 53 years old, 35 years on death row, 84 days past his 18th birthday when he killed Officer Danny Parrish. Cedric Allen Ricks was executed on March 11, 2026, in Texas, 51 years old, convicted of the murders of Roxann Sanchez and her 8-year-old son Anthony, the surviving son Marcus present at the window when he died. Michael Lee King was executed on March 17, 2026, in Florida, 54 years old, convicted of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Denise Lee, whose death changed 911 dispatch law across the United States. 3 men. 3 cases. 1 month. And a set of questions that will still be asked long after the names have faded from the news cycle. If you want to understand the full machinery of American death row, the cells, the years, the appeals, the final hours, the next documentary on this channel goes deeper into the system than anything we have covered so far. It is worth your time.